Okay, I know I said it was a quick break, but if you're just joining us, we are doing a giveaway in the CakeFest chat channel. If you could import a feature from another framework to Cake PHP, what would it be and why? And be nice. We're keeping things positive here. Everybody is joining us and everything has been great so far. So keep your comments nice and positive and we can interact in that CakeFest channel. But we're going to keep it moving to get back on schedule a little bit. If you want to learn more about documenting your API, we are going to introduce our next speaker, part of our core team, Chris Nizzardini. Welcome.
Okay, welcome everyone. Let me get my screen shared. Okay, hopefully everyone can hear me okay. My name is Chris Nizzardini, and I'll be talking about documenting your API today with OpenAPI. First, a little bit about me. I started developing in 2006 and started with Cake PHP around 2010. So that would have been Cake 2, but I did a little bit with Cake 1, but primarily a lot of experience in Cake 3 and 4. Some of my API experience, lots of personal projects, some open source, private commercial, and most recently in the public sector of federal government. That's me in Tuk Tuk in Thailand. I do enjoy traveling, which I can't do right now. Hockey, can't play it right now. But good thing I do love programming because that's something that can't be taken away right now. So I wanted to set the tone of this with a developer survey that was done by Postman. They do this every year. They survey 10,000 respondents, and this is some of the things they found. So about half of respondents have 3 years or less experience with API development. So about half are junior, kind of junior tier developers, and then the other half would be mid to senior. Over 60% spend at least 10 hours a week on API development. So more than half are spending 25% of their time in APIs. And API usage is split pretty equally. It's 50-50 just about between internal APIs and external APIs. I'm sorry if we're going to get sirens. I'm in downtown DC and it is a little loud, so I apologize about that. So let's see, I lost my track there. Okay, and so here were the more disconcerting parts about this developer survey they did. About half said API documentation is either below average or not documented well at all. And I think that's something we've all experienced when implementing APIs or even just perusing open source libraries. And so that leads into the most helpful enhancement that we can make as API producers are increasing the amount of examples in our documentation, following standards, as well as sample code. So let's talk about some reasons we're not maintaining documentation. It can be a very manual process. It's tedious, it's time consuming. If we're in a agile development environment, particularly in an early stage of development, our API schema endpoints, they can change quite drastically and cause our documentation to become dated rather quickly. Perhaps we never built any documentation and now we feel it's too much work. On the management side of things, management might say, this doesn't add revenue, so we don't want to devote labor time to creating documentation. We simply just don't have the time. Perhaps we simply don't know how to create documentation, what tools to use. And for all these reasons, we don't care enough about documentation. And I want to dispel with these notions before getting into OpenAPI. So number one is developer experience does matter. And I don't think there's a difference here between whether this is a strictly internal API or a B2B or B2C type API. So when we onboard a new engineer, it can take months for that engineer to reach a high level of efficiency. So there's learning the culture of the company. There's obviously learning the code base. There's any kind of domain logic and terms that we're not familiar with when we come into a new industry. So anything we can do to kind of bootstrap that developer is a win. And documentation is a key way of doing that. On the commercial side, we can streamline the implementation of developers implementing our API if we have good documentation, good examples. If you have that commercial type of API, support inquiries cost money, and a poorly documented API will incur additional support inquiries. Another thing is, as API developers, we don't have a user interface. So I really view documentation as the user interface for an API. And in the same way that if I go to a README for an open source library, or I go to any website and it's either not a particularly compelling UI or the README is pretty scant, it's a red flag for me. And the same with an API without good documentation. But prior to where I work now, I was in the hotel and travel space. We had to constantly bring online all these different inventory APIs. It's amazing that our hotel bookings work with the amount of different APIs your booking requests will travel through. But all things being equal, when the product owner came to me and said, hey, we're looking at these APIs, that the cost is relatively the same, the amount of inventory we'll gain is relatively the same. Whether they had good documentation or not was like a huge factor when I'm determining which API we should put in the development pipeline. So marketing matters, and in this case, documentation is marketing. And we can automate portions of our documentation with OpenAPI. So let's get into that. So OpenAPI used to be called Swagger. Since version 3, it's OpenAPI. It describes RESTful APIs, including requests, responses, and schemas. It has a robust ecosystem, Swagger, ReDoc, also client generators, and OpenAPI can be imported directly into Postman. So the first portion of the YAML you'll build in OpenAPI consists of some basic metadata about your API, the title, description. It has paths, which are endpoints, and those endpoints consist of operations, request responses, and those consist of components such as schemas and parameters. And then there's the option for extensibility. We'll get into that in just a bit. So there we go again, just another siren, okay. So the beginning of our YAML consists of some of that metadata I was talking about, the version of OpenAPI you're using, the version of your API, title, a description block that can be quite big. If you begin with a pipe here, you can have, you can include as much text as you want, really. So that's a great place to include initial documentation. Your licensing, various servers that clients can interact with. Pretty simple stuff there. Paths, very easy. It's just an endpoint that consists of operations: post, patch, put, delete, get. So let's look at some of those operations. We'll look at a post one here. Here we would just have a simple summary. The type, since this is a post, we have a request body, and so we'll describe the content types this operation will accept, as well as the schemas associated with that content type. So here we've defined an older style form type API, but it can also accept JSON, and it will respond with JSON with a city schema here. And I think this next one is get. So a little different on get. We don't have a request body. Instead, we're just accepting query parameters. And so this is an example of what a collection might look like. So we using like CakePHP paginator component. So we'll have a sort parameter, page limit, direction, and then down in our response, we're returning an array of objects in this case. And we'll get into what these ref variables mean in just a second. Let's take a look at schema now. Schema is just analogous to CakePHP model or entity. We can define a type, format, which is optional, but it can specify additional things like date, time, email. It just further explains the type. We can include some validation type stuff here, like min length, max length. There's options for regex. You can specify enumerated values like a list. And we can express associations such as like a belongs to or has one, things like that down here at the bottom. So a city belongs to a country, of course. And vendor extensions. So these are things that we can put into our own application. They will not be parsed by Swagger or ReDoc. And it's a nice way to hide hide components that you don't want to appear in some of the tooling leveraging your OpenAPI, but you could still reference them throughout your schema. So you might have different. So one thing I like to do is hide these. Basically, extend my schemas by having writables and addables, and that's because different fields can have different requirements based on whether you're doing a post or a patch. Like some fields are only required on a post, meanwhile they're not required on a patch. And so this is one of the ways you can accomplish that. Vendor extensions are of course used by like ReDoc. If you've ever been browsing ReDoc and you see code samples in like PHP, Java, Node, that's a custom extension that ReDoc supports. And so you would just follow the documentation for that extension, and then it would display code samples in those languages. So some of the tools that I found helpful, editor.swagger.io is great. It's basically just a WYSIWYG with a YAML on the left and what Swagger would look like on the right. You can paste OpenAPI JSON directly into it, and it reformats it as YAML. It also has some options to generate clients and servers right there in the upper menu. For a more complete client generation list, there's this NPM package, OpenAPI Generator. And you can generate a client from OpenAPI in almost any language. Here's an example of generating a PHP client. So I'll specify that with the G switch and output it to a PHP client directory, taking in my OpenAPI YAML with the I switch, and I skip validation there because it won't work if there's even a warning. But this is a great way of being able to generate samples of implementing your API in languages you may not know. Another great site is OpenAPI Tools. There's a ton of features there, open source and some commercial products as well. There's one in there that will take in your OpenAPI and run a security scan against your API just based on your schema definitions. So there's a ton of great tools in there. So OpenAPI YAML is pretty easy to get. It does that, but it can be a bit verbose typing that out by hand. So what a lot of languages began doing was saying, you know, YAML's great, but we're going to bring it more in line with the code with annotations. So PHP has this Zerko library. There's many, excuse me, take a drink of water. And there's several framework adaptations of this. So CakePHP has alt3 CakePHP Swagger. And other frameworks like Laravel, Symfony have their own adaptations. So let's take a look at what annotations look like here. You can see this is really similar to YAML. We have our path, a summary, what it outputs, what we're taking in a single sort parameter here, and we specify response. And in this way, we've brought our OpenAPI definitions in line with our code. Probably has a higher probability of a developer keeping this documentation up to date. I know there's, I know annotations are a sticky subject in the development world, so some may love this, some may despise this. This can get quite verbose over time, though, and you may end up having like a 20-to-1 ratio on annotations versus code. Some may love that, some may dislike it. So we can build our OpenAPI in YAML. We can build it with annotations, but that still may be too manual and tedious for me. So what confounded me a bit is, regardless of the framework you're using, you have all this great metadata, all this information you've packed into your routes, your schema, query parameters, the metadata that's already stored in your doc blocks. We've taken time to build DTOs. We've got our authentication and numerous other things defined within our code. So why can't that just be converted into OpenAPI for me? So other projects have tackled this. Symfony's API platform does this. They're still a bit heavy on annotations, but they can infer a lot from the framework. Fast API, which is a Python project, I've been playing around with that. They do a great job doing this. Spring for Java does this as well as many others. So wait a minute, I thought this was a CakeFest. We have all this information in CakePHP. We have RESTful routes. We have controllers, models, validations, doc blocks, DTOs if we built them, and all this other great information that we've built our applications on. So just bake it for me. How can we do that? Well, we can do that. So as when the pandemic started, after I watched everything on Netflix in the first 2 weeks, I decided to start building CakePHP Swagger Bake, and it tackles the problem I saw of not wanting to maintain this separate YAML file and not wanting to add in a ton of annotations in my code. So it parses, it gets the information of our Cake project and leverages some doc blocks to automatically create OpenAPI for us. So this is a basic collection type endpoint on the left, and it's able to determine that it's gonna read in the doc blocks there. It knows a response is gonna be an array of objects, and that's pretty good. But what else can we get out of our doc blocks? We can get a lot more. So if we're using if we're specifying what a method can throw, we can determine other responses. So we know a method not allowed exception will yield a 405 error. So we can build that automatically. We can read in deprecations. If we're using a C tag, we can link out to external documentation and display that automatically. I did find that it was nearly impossible to get away from annotations entirely without getting into like weird code parsing. So I did see the need for some annotations, but I wanted to make them really easy. So if we're using pagination, we shouldn't need to describe a bunch of query parameters. We already know what those are, and paginator is built really well. We can define the fields in the component already, so we can read that data in and build our parameters automatically. And that got me thinking, what else could the Cake community use for API development? Cake out of the box is really great. And I love Cake PHP. Some of the initial scaffolding and stuff, though, is really geared towards non-API development. So when I was looking at this, I was thinking, well, we could use some exceptions that work out of the box a little bit better. We're missing some response formats, such as HAL JSON and JSON LD. Bake doesn't bake in an API first style yet. There's this concept of what I call auto routing that API platform did kind of well, though they're still heavy on annotations. But ultimately, I was like, could we use a plugin specifically designed for API development? And I think we could. So after building Swagger Bake, I started on Mixer API, and that has an OpenAPI generator, a RESTful bake theme, an enhanced exception renderer, those additional response formats, this auto router type thing, which I'll show in just a second here. I have a brief demo, but there's still a lot more I'd like to do with this. There's an app skeleton, kind of Dockerized project I'd like to build up with that. And I'd love any kind of contributions from the community. There's like a ton of ideas for packages I have that would improve Mixer API. It is alpha stage. Some of the design philosophy around it, though, is a component-based architecture. So it's not like a monolith plugin. You can use each of the components in isolation and just compose or require them. So let's hop into a demo here. All right, so we've got a pretty standard Cake application here. We have some actors, we have some films, and we have some kind of secondary tables that link that data together. And this is just standard bake code. So let's look at actors. So we baked this. We've got some Flash messaging in here, which isn't helpful for an API. We've got redirects, which aren't helpful for APIs. So let's see how we can bake this into a RESTful API real quick. So So we're just going to do this real quick. Let's look at what that did. Okay. So we're limiting the allowed methods. We're now serializing data. And in some cases, we're just returning a status code as per usual with RESTful API. So we gain a little bit of helpfulness there. And what happens if we do this now? Okay, well, not much changed here. But we can change that real quick here. If we just go into our routes, get rid of some of these defaults here. And we're going to use an auto router to automatically build the RESTful resources. And we're going to connect in a Swagger UI here. To do that would be, I've already installed that, but there's an installer that will generate an initial seed YAML file for OpenAPI, as well as a minor configuration, which is just this. So I've enabled that. Let's go to the home page now. Okay, so it's reading in all of our information from doc blocks and our routes and our existing schema. We've got a few formats available to us. Let's just do JSON. And that's pretty good, but this is a request on a collection, so let's help out Swagger real quick. Great, so we can sort by last name in a descending order. We can go to page 2, we can limit by 5. And we can, of course, flip into other formats. Let's do JSON LD. Why not? All right. And let's try submitting. Let's try adding something new here. Okay, so we get an exception, which is good because we didn't include enough data, but it doesn't really tell us enough. So how can we get more information? We can do that pretty quickly just by switching our exception renderer. Let's try this again now. And there we go. We emit a validation exception, and it lets us know each of the properties and the validation rule that we didn't meet. This really works hand in hand with Cake Validator. So if we refresh this now, we notate that that's required, and it plays pretty nicely with just inferring additional data from validations and schema. So we have a rating, like a film rating here, and I specified that it's an in-list validator, so it's going to display that automatically. And so, yeah, if you're interested in playing around with this or contributing, I'd appreciate that. You can just go to mixerapi.com. There's a live demo and source code, some helpful documentation, a link to the GitHub, which has all of the packages involved. And with that, I'll conclude this talk. If you have any questions for me, that's my handles on Twitter and Slack. And I guess I will look in here, maybe if there was, let's see, if there's any questions. Let's see. I'm not sure if there, I'm not sure if there's any questions. So if there are questions, I'll just I'll answer them in the chat.
Yeah, there's
I
some.
think you have some in the Q&A.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you click Q&A down at the
It's
bottom.
this.
Okay. Yeah. I got you. All right. So how does this work with API versions? Okay. So Mixer API is still quite alpha, full disclosure. So I haven't necessarily thought through how it might work with versioning. And so one of the goals of Mixer API is to not be opinionated. So I didn't want to design a plugin and don't want to design a plugin that takes over, that's going to interfere with other Cake PHP plugins. So I don't necessarily have a good answer on that. The way I've handled API versioning in the past is by creating plugins. So I might have a V1 plugin and a V2 plugin for my API, but there's another belief that you don't really version your API and you just sunset features and use some like headers and whatnot, and you deprecate things. I don't have a great answer on that. I haven't thought about necessarily how that would be taken into account with Mixer. Yeah, so PHP 8 annotations or attributes, I guess. I haven't thought about, I haven't really sat down and looked at that enough, but yeah, I definitely think in the coming month or two here, I think PHP 8 is maybe going out in December. I want to see how that would play, but obviously these will now be like legacy annotations are going to continue to work with PHP 8. But yeah, for the Swagger Bake project, I'd like to integrate attributes in. Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Chris. All right, everything going good now, and don't